You're not a warrior. You're not a hunter. You don't hurl spears at bison or climb cliffs chasing wild goats. No, your calling is quieter, and somehow more terrifying. You are the village healer. It's 7,000 years before anyone will utter the word antibiotics. There are no metal instruments, no sterilization, and certainly no written scrolls of medical knowledge passed down from a higher authority. What you know, you've learned by observing the sky, listening to the whispers of older healers, and interpreting the rhythms of wind and bone. You wake up before the sun rises, because healing doesn't wait for daylight. There's a cough in the elder's hut that hasn't stopped in 3 days. A young boy fell and struck his head on a rock. He hasn't woken since yesterday. A woman miscarried in the night, and her blood will not stop. These are your responsibilities. Not because you're qualified by anything modern, but because no one else knows what to do. You are the only one who even dares to try. You reach for your satchel, stitched from deer hide and softened with bear fat. Inside are your sacred tools, flakes of obsidian as sharp as razors, a fishbone needle for stitching wounds, dried moss for packing cuts, and a bundle of dried herbs tied with twine, yarrow, juniper. Maybe something a spirit once whispered to your grandmother about keeping fevers down. Most importantly, there is your trepanation tool, a sharpened stone with a grip shaped by your own fingers from years of use. It is old. It is deadly. It is necessary. You are feared by some in the tribe. They say you talk to spirits, that your dreams predict illness, that you can summon visions with smoke. They also say that you carry death in your fingers, that when you touch someone, their fate is sealed. Some people won't look you in the eyes. Others leave offerings at your door, a carved bone, a few berries, a tuft of fur, all tokens of thanks, or fear. No one understands what you do. They only know that when someone falls sick or starts screaming in the night with madness or pain, you are the last hope before the gods come to claim them. And if you fail, they may blame you, or worse, exile you. So you go, with trembling hands hidden under calm eyes. Today, someone will beg you to take the pain away, but you cannot take it. You can only cut, only drill, only burn, and then wait. This is your place in the world, not of glory, but of grim purpose. You are not a warrior. You are not a hunter. You are the healer, and someone is already screaming. The hut is dark when you enter. It's always dark. There are no windows, only a small opening in the roof where the smoke curls upward in a lazy spiral, carrying with it the sin of old ash and something more sour. Dry blood, maybe, or mold. You stop trying to name the smells. The ground beneath your feet is cold and uneven, pressed down by bear saws over many seasons. Straw, earth, and animal skins form a soft but musty floor. In one corner, a pile of bones, carefully sorted, rests beside a mortar carved from sandstone. You used it last week to grind nettle leaves into a bitter paste. The paste didn't work. The fever took her anyway. The air inside is thick, warm, and wet. The fire doesn't burn cleanly, it never does. Too much greenwood. Too many herbs thrown into the flames. The smoke stings your eyes, but you've learned not to blink too much. The elders think it means weakness. They say a real healer doesn't mind smoke. You wonder if their lungs are stronger than yours, or if they're just used to dying sooner. On a low shelf made of stone slabs, your tools rest in a line. The fishbone needle, the slivers of flint, the wooden bowl filled with murky water, bits of bark floating on top. You crouch down to examine your kit, not for cleanliness, but for sharpness. Sterility doesn't exist here. Only edge, only heat, only pressure. A small animal skull hangs from the ceiling above your work area. A talisman. You found it near the river, its jaw still attached. You cleaned it with your own hands, carved a spiral symbol into its forehead, and hung it with sinew. Some days you believe it helps. Other days, it just stares back at you, empty. The patient lies on a pallet of reeds and hide in the corner. She is a girl, maybe 12. Her father brought her in at dawn. Her head is wrapped in cloth, soaked through. Blood or pus or both. Her eyes flutter when she moans. Her breathing is slow and wet. You listen. You don't touch yet. Outside, someone chants softly, calling to the spirits of air and water. You don't stop them. Let them pray. Maybe the gods will do what you cannot. There is no privacy in your work. Others watch from the doorway, crouched and silent. They won't speak unless you ask. They won't interfere, but they will judge. If she dies, they'll remember. If she lives, they might forget the last 3 who didn't. You light a bundle of dried sage and wave it once, twice, to clear the space. Or maybe just to stall. The smoke joins the others, rising toward the roof hole. You inhale slowly. This is your place. This is your world. Stone, smoke, sweat, and silence. You pick up the stone tool. The girl stirs. It begins. You kneel beside your patient and reach into your bundle. Not a leather bag, not a carved chest, just a folded deer skin, its corners tied with sinew. Inside is your entire world. Everything you can use to fight pain, sickness, and death is wrapped in this worn, blood-stained cloth. You untie it slowly, deliberately, not for show, but because haste in this work leads to mistakes. And mistakes here are final. The first tool you lift is a thin shard of obsidian. Black as night, glassy, almost beautiful. It was given to you by an elder who claimed it came from a sacred mountain far away, passed from healer to healer. You've never been to that mountain, but you believe it. The edge is impossibly sharp, sharper than any modern scalpel ever will be. You've used it to lance boils, scrape rot from wounds, and even cut through sinew when someone's leg couldn't be saved. But its edge is fragile. It snaps if you push too hard. You learned that once, the hard way. The blade broke inside a wound. You never found the piece. The man didn't survive. Next is a flat, wide flint scraper. Not for precision, but for grinding. You use it to remove skin, little by little, when preparing to open the skull. Trepanation requires patience, not force. You cannot simply smash your way in. The bone must be coaxed, layer by layer, until the spirits can escape, or the pressure, or whatever's inside. You also carry a thin awl made from sharpened bone, a relic. No one else in the tribe carves tools as delicately anymore. You use it like a probe to trace wounds, test soft tissue, or sometimes, when all else fails, to puncture swollen flesh and let the poison out. There's a small bundle of herbs, wrapped in woven reeds. Dried lavender, if you're lucky enough to have traded for it. More often it's juniper, yarrow, or crushed poppy seed pods, harsh and bitter. You mix them into pastes or burn them over hot stones, hoping the smoke will dull the pain. Not for curing, nothing really cures, but for calming. Your needle is a fishbone, honed by hand until its tip could pierce hide. You pair it with sinew thread, pulled from deer legs, soaked in fat to keep it supple. You've stitched closed cuts longer than your arm with it. And once, you stitched the lips of a man who tried to bite out his own tongue during a seizure. He lived. Mostly. There's a drinking horn, carved with spirals, filled with honeyed water and bits of boiled bark. You offer it before procedures. Sometimes they drink. Sometimes they spit. Sometimes they choke and scream. You've learned not to expect much. And finally, your trepanning stone. A flat, circular piece of sandstone, rough and pitted. It fits perfectly in your palm, worn down by years of grinding against bone. You hold it gently now. This is the tool that gives you nightmares. The one that divides healers from butchers. The one you've used 3 times this season alone. You look down at the girl. Her breathing is shallow. Her eyes do not focus. Her father is still waiting outside. You place the stone beside her head. The work will begin soon. And your tools, these ancient, crude, sacred things, will either bring her back from the edge or push her over it. You don't have names for most of the things that kill your people. There is no word for epilepsy, no concept of infection, no idea of what a bacterial parasite is. You don't understand blood loss in terms of liters, or brain swelling in terms of pressure. All you know is what you see, what you smell, what you hear, and what the spirits whisper to you in your sleep. Most ailments begin the same way. Someone doesn't return from the hunt, or they come back limping, glass-eyed, with a gash down the side of their face or blood pooling at their temple. You've seen skulls cracked by club strikes, faces torn open by boars, children trampled by frightened deer. These are obvious. These you can touch, stitch, cover, cut. But others, they creep. They come from within. A man will wake up fine in the morning, and by nightfall his eyes roll back, and he speaks in tongues. The tribe says he's cursed. You say it's the same illness that took your brother, the one that ends in seizures. You've tried many things. Herbs, smokes, stones pressed to the forehead. You've even made small cuts in the scalp and bled them out, hoping the spirit would leave through the wound. Sometimes it works. Sometimes they die foaming at the mouth. There's the rot, too. It begins in a tooth. Just a little pain when chewing meat. But in a few days, the jaw swells. The cheek turns purple. Fever comes. Then the skin splits. The smell is unmistakable. You try to drain it. You pack it with moss. But once it reaches the brain, there's nothing left to do. They scream until they fall silent. Children are most fragile. The cold wind takes them easily. A cough becomes a rattle. A fever becomes a flame inside them. You try warm stones, smoked herbs, chest pounding. You sing the lullabies your mother taught you, the ones meant for sickness, not sleep. Still, you bury more children than you save. Then there's madness. People vanish into the woods, speaking to trees. One man ate his own fingers, saying his hand was possessed. Another woman claimed to see her dead mother standing at the river each night, calling her home. The tribe fears them. You are asked to heal them. You try chants, burn roots, use sleep stones. Sometimes you drill a hole in the head, just a small one. Let the bad air out. Let the demons escape. If they survive, it's a miracle. If not, no one speaks of it again. The worst cases are the ones with no marks, no blood, no screams, just a slow fading. A man who once laughed loudly now sits by the fire in silence. A girl who danced stops eating. Their skin grows pale. Their bodies shrink. Nothing hurts, they say, but they are already gone in some unseen way. These are the most helpless to treat. You sit beside them, place herbs in their hands. Sometimes you cry, quietly. You keep the skulls of some who died, not as trophies, but as reminders of what you couldn't fix, of what you still don't understand. And yet, the tribe still comes to you, because you're the healer. Because even when you fail, they believe you're closer to the truth than anyone else. Because, in a world without words for disease, you are the only one brave enough to face the unknown. There is no such thing as numbness here. Pain is not reduced, avoided, or managed. It is endured. It is part of the ritual, part of the healing, part of the price. You have no poppy syrup, no chloroform, no ether to soak into cloth. You have smoke, some bitter roots, and whatever prayers you can remember in the moment. That is all. Before you begin, you sometimes offer the patient a mixture, boiled bark and crushed seeds in warm water. It tastes like soil and burns the tongue. You say it will help them sleep. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it only makes them hallucinate, see flames in your eyes or ghosts behind their shoulders. You don't lie. You only offer. Most drink anyway. Hope is its own kind of drug. For wounds, you work quickly, cleaning, stitching, pressing. But for the deeper things, skull work, trepanation, there is no quick way. You have to take your time. You must go slowly, gently, like peeling bark from a living tree without killing it. And that means pain. The patient bites down on leather or wood. You press your free hand against their chest to keep them still. They thrash. They scream. The stone tool makes its circle again and again, grinding into the skull. There's no blood at first, just the sound, the horrible, quiet rasp of stone against bone. You don't stop when they scream. You can't. If you stop, they die. The others outside the hut hear it. Some cover their ears. Some murmur chants. No one leaves. They all wait to see if the healer will succeed, or if the patient will fall silent forever. If the patient loses consciousness, you check their breath. You whisper their name. You keep going. Sometimes they faint from the pain. Sometimes they never wake again. You've seen teeth shatter from the force of their own jaw. Eyes roll back. Bodies arch and convulse. These are not rare events. These are the cost of your work. You do not flinch. Not anymore. You did once, long ago. The first time a child screamed and begged you to stop, you did. You panicked. You froze. She died 2 hours later. Now, you keep your rhythm. Pain, in this world, is not an enemy. It is a companion. It reminds you that the body is still fighting, still alive, still here. You will clean the wound with moss and salt water. Wrap it and hide. Whisper words to soothe the spirit. But the echo of their screams stays with you, even after they sleep, especially if they never wake. The cutting is done. The wound has been cleaned with moss soaked in bitter root water. The skin, what remains of it, has been wrapped in hide, tied with sinew, and smeared with a thick paste of honey, ash, and herbs. Your hands are trembling, though no one can see it in the dark. Now comes the waiting. There are no post-surgery beds here. No nurses. No charts. Only a straw mat, a smoky hut, and your quiet breath beside the patient. You stay close, not because you expect change, but because this moment is fragile. Time moves slowly here. Each breath the girl takes is a question. Each minute without fever is a kind of miracle. You keep a wet cloth by her head. You listen to the gurgle in her chest. You change her dressing when it stiffens with blood. You chew the herbs and press them into her wound yourself. Your spit is part of the medicine. That's what your grandmother taught you. If you won't give part of your body, the spirits won't give back theirs. Sometimes she moans. Sometimes she's silent. You speak softly to her, telling stories from your childhood, stories of rivers and stars, of hunters and moonlight. Not because you think she hears you, but because you need the sound to push back the silence. You monitor the heat in her skin, not with tools, just your palm. If it grows too hot, you crush fever roots and drip them between her lips. If she won't drink, you rub them into her gums. If she twitches, you hold her shoulders gently and sing. There is no clear sign of success. You only know if she lives. And if she does, she may not be the same. Some wake with no memory. Others with strange moods, or sudden fear of light, or visions they cannot explain. The tribe says they've seen the other world and returned. You don't argue. You don't know what happens when you open the skull. You only know that you did it, and they're still breathing. If she wakes, you'll be called a miracle worker. They'll leave offerings by your door, berries, shells, a fresh rabbit. The elder will nod. The children will stare. The father will not speak, only grip your wrist and bow his head. But if she doesn't wake, if her breath slows or stops, then they will not speak at all. They will carry her body away before dawn. You will not be blamed, not openly, but the silence will be heavier. Eyes will no longer meet yours. And one day, someone will suggest another healer from another valley, just to see if their spirits are stronger. You have seen both ends of this story many times. Still, you sit here, by her side, watching her chest rise and fall. Because for now, she's alive. And that, in your world, is the closest thing to victory. It's easy to think the healer was respected. Some were. But respect in a prehistoric tribe was a strange and fragile thing built not on knowledge, but fear, uncertainty, and desperate hope. You weren't a warrior who brought home meat. You didn't carve tools or build shelters. You dealt with death, with screams, with wounds that most would rather not look at. You touched things no one else dared to touch. And for that, you were both needed and shunned. When people lived, they called you wise. When they died, they blamed the gods or you. No one remembered the child whose cough faded after your smokes. They remembered the girl who bled out after you opened her skull. They remembered her name, her face, the way she cried. And somehow, that became your fault. You didn't bring the sickness, but it arrived at your door all the same. You didn't break the bone, but it was your hands that cut it open. You lived at the edge of the village, not by law, but by custom. People said it was to give you quiet, to let you commune with the spirits. But in truth, it was because they were afraid of what you carried. Bad luck, disease, the memories of those who didn't survive. You ate last, sat alone by the fire. At night, you sometimes woke to find feathers or bones left at your doorway, gifts, maybe, or warnings, or both. You weren't allowed to cry, not in front of them. The healer must be strong. The healer must know. But the truth was, you knew very little. Every wound was a guess. Every fever was a test. Every procedure, especially trepanation, was a walk across a crumbling bridge with no railings, no plan, and no return. You carried the burden of every death like stones in your satchel. Heavy, unseen, constant, and even in success, there was no peace. The survivors often changed. Some became silent, staring into the fire for hours. Others spoke of voices, visions, strange dreams they couldn't shake. They said you had touched their soul, and not all of it came back. People looked at them differently, and they looked at you as if you had opened a door that never should have been touched. Worst of all, you had no one to teach you. No books, no diagrams, only fading memories from the last healer, and the pain etched in your hands. You learned by doing. And when doing meant cutting into someone's skull while their family wept outside, the learning was a heavy thing. So why did you do it? Why didn't you run? Because you were needed. Because the tribe would have no one else. Because deep down, you believed the spirits still whispered to you, and maybe, just maybe, you could whisper back. But it sucked. It sucked to be the healer. Because no one remembered your quiet victories. Only the screams. There comes a moment when herbs are not enough. When chants and smoke fail. When the fever doesn't break, and the trembling only worsens. When the face droops on one side, or the eyes lose focus, or a person screams in agony without being touched. That's when you reach for the stone. The round one. The one no one else is allowed to hold. The one that doesn't belong to any world but this strange space between life and death. That's when you know you're going to cut into the skull. Trepanation is not your first choice. It's not even your fifth. It is the last door. The most dangerous path. But sometimes, it's the only one left. Maybe the patient fell from a tree and hasn't woken since. Maybe they've been shaking uncontrollably for hours. Maybe their madness has grown so loud that even the children run from them. You sit by the fire at night, listening to the winds and the cracking of the coals, asking yourself if the spirits would understand. You ask the old bones on your shelf. You ask the sky. But in the end, the decision is always yours. No one ever says the word. There isn't one. The tribe doesn't name this act. They just look at you when the pain has gone too far. You know the look. It's a question. It's fear wrapped in hope. Can you still save them? You don't answer out loud. You gather your tools. You prepare the fire. You light the herbs that call the spirits close. And they know. It isn't surgery. Not in the way the future will know it. There is no clean cloth, no glowing lamp, no steel instrument clicking into place. There is only a shaking chest, a wet brow, a piece of obsidian, and the cold pressure of stone against bone. You begin with the scraping slow, patient circles on the scalp until the skin yields and the skull gleams through the blood. Then the real work begins. You don't strike. You don't saw. You grind. In silence. Slowly. Reverently. And every second, you wonder, will they wake? Will they speak again? Will they survive? You've seen it go both ways. There was the boy who couldn't stop screaming until you opened his skull and the spirits fled. He lived another winter, smiling softly to himself, no longer haunted. But there was also the elder, the wise one with stories in his voice. He bled out before you reached the bone. You don't talk about it afterward. No one does. If they live, they're said to be touched by the sky. If they die, they are returned to the earth as quietly as possible. Their skull sometimes kept, not as a warning, but as a memory. This is the edge of healing, the line between knowledge and desperation. You don't cross it lightly, but when you do, you hold the stone with both hands, and you pray the gods are watching. They found him buried face up in soft soil. His skeleton lay undisturbed for thousands of years, curved in death, arms folded gently across his chest, the skull tilted slightly to the left as if still listening to something long gone. At first, it seemed like any other Neolithic burial. An adult male, mid-30s perhaps, with worn joints and thick limb bones, a life of labor etched into the very calcium of his being. But then they looked at his skull and counted. One hole, then another, and another. 7 in total, each hole about the width of a thumbprint. Each one carved deliberately, no signs of trauma, no impact fractures, no indication of violence. They weren't caused by weapons. These were surgical. Trepanations. 7 separate attempts to open this man's skull while he was alive. And here's the strangest part. He survived them all. You can tell by the bone. A trained eye sees it immediately smooth regrowth around the edges of each opening. Signs of healing that take weeks, sometimes months, to form. This wasn't a man who endured a single emergency procedure. He endured a lifetime of them. The burial site was found in what is now modern-day France, near Ensisheim in the Alsace region. The grave dates back nearly 6,000 years, long before metal tools, before writing, before cities. This man lived in a world of stone and bone, fire and fear, myth and survival. And somehow, someone, or maybe many someones, decided that the solution to what afflicted him lay not in chance or herbs, but in drilling through his skull. Why? That question echoes through the centuries like the wind across an open field. Archaeologists named him for cataloging purposes. Specimen 2. Burial 16. But behind those numbers lies a person, a man with a name no one remembers, a story no one recorded, and a pain no one can now measure. The holes are clustered toward the rear and side of his skull. They're not random. They follow a kind of rough logic, as if the person performing them believed the ailment lived in a certain region of the head. One hole shows signs of deeper scraping, where the tool cut into the dip of the parietal bone. Another shows a beveled edge. Careful work, done with a rounded instrument that wouldn't shatter the fragile inner table of bone. This wasn't the work of someone guessing. It was practiced, purposeful, and yet, we don't know what they were trying to fix. Was he plagued by seizures? Blinding headaches? Visions? Madness? Or was it spiritual, a belief that he was touched by something sacred or cursed? Some anthropologists think he may have been a healer himself, one who offered his own skull to the gods for knowledge. Others think he was a patient, a victim, a man whose mind betrayed him again and again, and who was subjected to the only treatment known at the time. And what kind of person survives 7 openings to the brain? He must have been strong. His bones suggest a muscular frame, accustomed to hard work. Perhaps a respected elder. Perhaps someone seen as chosen. Or perhaps someone feared, kept alive because his pain was believed to contain wisdom. There are no grave goods around him. No beads, no blades, no animal bones. Just the skeleton, just the skull, and those 7 portals to a mystery we may never solve. We don't know his name, but we know his endurance. We know his story was written in bone, not words. And when we speak of trepanation, of prehistoric surgery, of early medical mystery, we speak of him, the man with 7 holes in his head. Bones don't lie. Long after the skin has rotted and memories have vanished, the skeleton remains. It holds no opinions, no embellishments, only the quiet truth of what the body endured. And in the case of this man, buried 6 millennia ago, his skull is not just a record of survival. It is a ledger of pain, persistence, and puzzling purpose. When archaeologists lifted his cranium from the earth and brushed away the dust of centuries, they saw what few had seen before, not 1 or 2, but 7 distinct trepanation sites. 7 separate holes. Each one tells a story, not just of the man, but of the people around him. People who took the time, care, and risk to open his skull. Not once, not twice, but again and again and again. The first detail noticed by researchers wasn't the number of holes, it was the smoothness of their edges. In 3 of them, the bone had regrown significantly, forming rounded rims of dense calcified tissue. This kind of healing takes time. Weeks at minimum, months in most cases. The man had not only survived these procedures, he had lived long enough afterward for his body to begin repairing the damage. That alone is extraordinary. Even more remarkable was that none of the trepanations appear to have been performed in response to external trauma. There were no fracture lines radiating from the holes, no depression marks, no evidence of a blow or sharp impact that would have necessitated emergency surgery. These holes were not battlefield repairs. They were intentional, perhaps preemptive, perhaps ritualistic, perhaps both. The locations of the holes offer another layer of evidence. They are not scattered randomly. Instead, they appear to follow patterns seen in other prehistoric skulls that underwent trepanation. Several are positioned along the sagittal and parietal bones, areas believed by ancient people to be linked to thought, vision, or perhaps spiritual connection. The symmetry suggests a method. The spacing suggests planning. Whoever performed these surgeries had experience. Microscopic analysis of the edges reveals even more. In the healed holes, there are tiny grooves, like the soft scratches left by scraping with a sharp tool. These marks tell us how the bone was opened, not by cutting straight through, but by slowly abrading the skull layer by layer, using a circular motion. This technique, scraping, is the most common method of trepanation found in Neolithic Europe. It was time-consuming, but it offered more control, less risk of penetrating too deep, less chance of killing the patient outright. Some holes also show a slight beveling of the inner edge, indicating the use of a concave tool, perhaps stone, perhaps bone, used to smooth or widen the opening after the initial breach. This would have required knowledge, precision, and a steady hand. But most telling of all is what is not there. There are no signs of infection, no signs of pus, bone deterioration, or necrosis. That means the wound sites were kept clean, remarkably so for an era without sterilization or even knowledge of germs. Perhaps they used ash or honey, both known for their antibacterial properties. Perhaps they used smoke, herbs, or clay. We don't know, but somehow they prevented the skull from turning septic. And that might be the greatest mystery of all. There's also no evidence of restraint marks on the wrists or ankles. No broken teeth. No jaw dislocations. This suggests that the patient was either unconscious or willing. He may have accepted the pain, or endured it in trance, or been sedated with smoke and ritual. It raises strange questions about his role. Was he seen as a conduit to another world? A mystic whose suffering had meaning? Or was he simply desperate for relief again and again? The skull does not answer these questions, but it presents them, clearly, quietly, without judgment. The holes are still there, smooth, silent, empty, and yet, somehow, full of life. He had no name, at least none that we know. No inscription, no carving, no spoken memory passed down through generations. And yet, when you hold his skull, you can feel a question pulsing beneath the bone. Who was he? The facts are few, but the implications are vast. A man buried with care. 7 trepanation holes. Multiple signs of healing. No grave goods. No injuries. And so, we begin to wonder, was he revered or feared? Was he chosen or cursed? Some archaeologists suggest he may have been a healer himself. In certain Neolithic cultures, The act of trepanation wasn't only medical. It was symbolic, spiritual, perhaps even sacred. A healer who submitted himself to the same treatments he offered to others might have been demonstrating his trust in the spirits or in his own skill. Each hole could have marked an initiation, a test of endurance, or a symbolic opening of the mind. In this light, his survival becomes a testament to his strength, and his repeated surgeries a ritual of transformation. Others believe he may have been a shaman or mystic, someone seen by the community as touched by otherworldly forces. The brain, even now, remains a mystery. But in prehistoric times, it was the seat of visions, madness, dreams, and divine messages. Perhaps this man claimed, or was believed, to speak with the dead, to hear the voices of the wind or the ancestors. Perhaps the holes in his skull were seen as literal windows to the beyond. Trepanation might have been their way of granting him access to unseen realms. Or maybe it was a form of control. If his visions became too intense, too wild, the tribe might have believed that opening his skull could release the pressure physically or spiritually. But there's a darker interpretation too, one where he was not respected, but feared. A man tormented by seizures or mental illness, whose behavior frightened those around him. In a time before diagnosis or treatment, fear was the closest thing to understanding. Perhaps he screamed at night, wandered into the forest, spoke to people who weren't there. The tribe may have interpreted this as possession or spiritual disturbance. Trepanation, then, would have been an exorcism, not a gift, but a necessity. A desperate attempt to bring him back from the edge. And when it didn't work the first time, they tried again. His burial offers few clues. The grave was shallow, but not crude. His body was placed with care, not tossed. There were no offerings, but also no signs of violence. No broken bones. No restraints. No missing teeth. He died, it seems, peacefully. That alone is meaningful. And what of the people who performed the surgeries? They must have had training or at least experience. Trepanation wasn't something you did without skill. Perhaps this man was part of a community that had passed down such knowledge over generations. Perhaps he lived among those who practiced early medicine in ways more sophisticated than we've long believed. In that case, he may have been both patient and teacher, both test subject and guide. Or maybe he was just a man who suffered from an ailment we will never name, and whose community, against all odds, tried again and again to save him. These are only speculations, of course. The bones tell part of the story, but not the soul. They do not speak of the mornings he woke to birdsong, the way he smiled when children played, the silence he carried in his mind, or the dreams he saw after each hole was carved. He may have been a healer. He may have been a mystic. He may have been a man in pain. But whoever he was, he lived long enough to be remembered. Not by name, but by bone. Not by voice, but by the mystery he left behind. To understand the man with 7 holes in his skull, you must understand the world he lived in. His story is not just etched in bone. It's woven into the soil he tilled, the winds he walked against, and the fragile thread of survival that bound every day of his life. He lived in Neolithic Europe, around 4000 BCE. This was not yet the world of empires or cities. There were no kings, no written laws, no currency, and no organized armies. Instead, there were small settlements, clusters of huts built from wood, thatch, and packed earth. Communities ranged from a few families to maybe 100 people at most. Everyone knew everyone. Life was shared, and so was suffering. He likely lived in a farming village, part of the first generation of humans to abandon the wild hunt and instead bend nature to their will. Farming was new, but demanding. Wheat and barley were sown by hand, grown in small plots, harvested with flint sickles, and ground into coarse flour. Goats and sheep were penned, not just hunted. Dogs lay by the fire. Children herded animals. The tribe lived on what they could grow and raise when the seasons allowed it, but nothing was guaranteed. Drought, pestilence, or disease could ruin a harvest. A bad winter could starve half a village. And if food ran out, there was no storehouse, no emergency grain supply, only the long walk to another settlement, hoping they had more than you did. This world was not silent, though. It was rich with sound, the grind of stones, the murmur of fires, the whisper of trees. And it was filled with ritual. Life was too uncertain not to believe in something larger. Spirituality was embedded into daily life, not as religion as we know it, but as a constant relationship with unseen forces. The sun and moon were more than orbs. They were living, watching. Rain was a gift. Thunder was a warning. The ancestors, long buried beneath sacred ground, still walked with you in dreams. You offered to them. You asked for guidance. You built stone circles. You buried the dead with care. He likely took part in these rituals. Or perhaps, because of his condition or his surgeries, he became the focus of them. A man who survived so many brushes with death could not be seen as ordinary. He may have been feared, or revered, or both. Clothing was simple: animal hides, woven plant fibers, leather shoes. Tools were made from stone, bone, and wood. There was no metal. Not yet. Flint was prized, obsidian more so. You didn't throw anything away. Everything had a purpose. Every broken pot was repurposed. Every bone used, if not for tools, then for ceremony. Health was always fragile. A tooth infection could be fatal. A twisted ankle could mean starvation. Fevers came and went like spirits. Children died often. Women died in childbirth. And for anything involving the mind, the strange behaviors, the fits, the voices, there was no explanation. Only fear, or awe. But in that uncertainty, there was community. People cared for one another because no one could survive alone. When one fell ill, others brought broth. When one was injured, others hunted in their place. When one wandered into madness, they still found a blanket by the fire. And so we returned to our man. In this world of closeness, fragility, and ritual, he endured. Whether he was seen as cursed or chosen, he lived among others. He worked. He slept. He bled. He likely helped harvest grain, carve wood, sing to the moon, or guide the younger ones. He was not just a patient. He was part of a people, a village, a small flicker of humanity glowing softly in the dark of prehistory. And that may be the most extraordinary thing of all. It begins with silence. No bustling tent, no bright light overhead, no sharp antiseptic sting. Just the hush of the hut, the crackle of the fire, and the low breath of someone about to enter pain. He would have been laid on his side or back, his head gently supported on a folded fur or mound of straw. Outside, people likely gathered, not to watch, but to wait. This was not a private act. It was a communal tension. Healing was a hope shared by all. He was not given anesthesia. There was none. Perhaps he chewed bitter herbs to dull his senses, poppy or henbane, if his people had access to them. Maybe he drank fermented brew. But even then, he would feel everything. There would be no gentle fade to black. No sleep. Just the scraping. The dull pressure. The sound. The healer, someone trusted, someone practiced, would begin by cleaning the scalp with water or smoke. Then came the first cut. A stone blade, sharp as glass, would slice through skin and muscle. The blood would be wiped away with moss or cloth, and then the real work would begin. Using a rounded piece of sandstone, flint, or obsidian, the healer would begin to scrape. Not dig, not drill. Scrape. In small, careful circles, grinding through the outer table of the skull, one layer at a time. The sound would be soft, almost sandy. The sensation vibrating through bone, unbearable. The process could take hours. And he survived it. Not once, but 7 times. Each time, the healer would have to judge depth with nothing but experience and instinct. Go too deep, and the patient would die instantly. Stop too soon, and the pressure, whatever it was, would remain. The inner layer of the skull was delicate, and just beneath it, the brain pulsed like a tide. The healer likely paused often, listening to breath, watching the face, feeling the warmth of the skull beneath their fingers. And always, there would be pain. Imagine the burning behind the eyes. The thudding heartbeat echoing through the ears. The vertigo, the nausea, the white flashes of agony. And still he remained, breathing, enduring. After the opening was complete, the wound would be cleaned again. Maybe packed with herbs or honey. Maybe covered with hide or bark. Some trepan skulls show evidence of bone plates placed over the hole, fragments tied down with sinew, or perhaps left loose to regrow. The healing period would have been slow. He would lie in a dark hut, his head bandaged, visited by others who whispered or wept. Fevers might come, infections might begin, but he would survive. And then it would happen again. Weeks, months, perhaps years later. Another episode, another seizure, another collapse, another hole. Each new wound would be made close to the last, but never overlapping. Perhaps the healers believed the old wounds had released some of the illness, but not all. Perhaps each one was meant to target a new place, a new spirit, a new cause. There is no evidence that he was restrained. That tells us something. Either he accepted the pain, or his condition made him unable to resist it. He may have believed, like those around him, that the holes would help, that the pain was part of the journey, that what lay beyond the bone was not death, but release. He would carry those holes with him through the seasons. In the summer heat, flies would gather around the healing scabs. In the cold, wind might whistle through the dressing. He would learn to live with the pressure, the dizziness, the strange sensations that must have followed him like shadows. But still, he walked. He breathed. He endured. And somehow, impossibly, he did it again. 7 times. Each scar a question. Each wound a story. Each hole a whisper from a world we'll never fully understand. The man with 7 holes in his skull was not alone, not in space, and not in time. Long before surgery became a science, long before pain had a name in Latin or healing had a handbook, humans across the globe, separated by oceans, mountains, deserts, and centuries, were performing the same act, cutting into the skull. The reasons, the tools, and the rituals may have varied, but the practice of trepanation appeared, again and again, like a shared whisper between civilizations that never met. Thousands of miles from the man buried in Neolithic France, on the windswept slopes of the Andean highlands, lived another group of people with a deep understanding of bone. In ancient Peru, trepanation became a cultural norm. Among the Paracas and Inca civilizations, skull surgeries were astonishingly common. Archaeologists have uncovered over 800 trepan skulls in the region, many of them showing signs of survival. Some skulls have more than one hole. Some have patterns. Some are so well healed that you might not notice them at all unless you looked closely. Why were they performing these surgeries? Some believe it was to treat head trauma, common in societies that practiced warfare with blunt weapons like slings and clubs. Others suggest spiritual or ritualistic purposes, possibly to release spirits or treat madness. What stands out, though, is the level of skill. Peruvian trepanations show precise technique, beveled holes, clean margins, clear signs of healing. They likely used obsidian blades, cactus spines, and natural antiseptics like chicha and coca leaves. Some skulls even show evidence of multiple procedures over a lifetime. And yet, they had no metal, no written instructions, only experience and belief. Travel now across the Sahara, into the deserts of ancient Nubia, present-day Sudan. Here too, trepan skulls have been discovered, dating back more than 6,000 years. The earliest known African trepanations show a cruder technique, more scraping, less precision, but again, signs of survival. In these cultures, as in others, the head was considered sacred, a seat of life, or soul, or ancestral memory. To alter it was not simply to heal the body, it was to interfere with the very fabric of being. In Russia, on the windswept steppe of the Altai Mountains, excavations have revealed trepan skulls among the ancient Scythians and related nomadic peoples. These were horse riders, archers, warriors, and healers too. Their trepanations show both rough and refined attempts. Some likely aim to reduce pain or pressure after injury. Others, we simply don't know. The holes remain, silent and clean, carved by hands that lived in tents beneath stars we no longer name. What does it mean that so many cultures, disconnected by geography and language, all arrived at the same idea? That the skull could be opened, that the pain within could be reached, that healing, somehow, lay on the other side of bone. Perhaps it means that trepanation wasn't madness. Perhaps it wasn't ignorance. Perhaps, for all its brutality, it was a kind of wisdom, one born not from science, but from the slow, difficult observation of life and death. People saw what happened to those with head wounds. They noticed when pressure built, when seizures struck, when madness overtook a loved one. And they decided, again and again, to act. Even if it hurt. Even if it killed. Even if they didn't know why. It's easy now, with clean hospitals and gleaming tools, to look back and dismiss it. But those 7 holes in the skull of a man in France are echoed in the Andes, in Africa, in Asia. They are not a curiosity. They are a language etched in calcium. They tell us that prehistoric humans were not passive. They fought to understand. They fought to survive. They fought to heal, even when the world gave them no instructions. They opened the skull, and sometimes they saved a life. The skull does not speak, but it remains. When flesh has vanished, when names are forgotten, when even the stories have dimmed into silence, the skull stays behind, quiet, hollow, eternal. And when it is marked, carved, shaped, or opened, it becomes more than a vessel for thought. It becomes a symbol Trepan's skulls, in many cultures, did not always go back into the earth. Some were kept, displayed, reused, revered. There is evidence, scattered and subtle, that some ancient peoples saw these altered skulls not just as remnants of surgery, but as sacred artifacts. In parts of Neolithic Europe, skulls with holes were found deliberately placed in homes or buried under thresholds. Not discarded, not hidden, honored, as if the person's suffering had given the bone power, or insight, or protective energy. In Peru, some Trepan skulls were drilled again post-mortem, not for healing, but to create holes for hanging. Through these, cords were tied, and the skulls were worn or displayed. Some were found in ceremonial graves, strung together like beads. These weren't trophies of war. They were something else, something gentler, stranger. A way to keep someone close after death, or perhaps to preserve the wisdom they were believed to have gained through suffering. In Melanesian and Oceanic societies, skulls were sometimes painted, preserved, or even given homes of their own. A Trepan skull, especially, might have held spiritual value, seen as a portal that had once been opened, a conduit to another world. The hole itself became part of the story, a mark of connection, a scar that transformed bone into relic. In parts of the Caucasus and Central Asia, skull fragments with trepanation holes have been discovered shaped into pendants or tokens, worn, possibly for protection, maybe by family members, maybe by the next healer in line, a way of carrying strength forward, a reminder that healing could happen, even in the face of pain. Sometimes, these skulls were buried in separate places from the body, placed in sacred corners of a site, stored in caves. This separation suggests ritual, reverence, as if the skull, once opened, had become its own sacred object, too powerful, perhaps, to return fully to the earth. And what of the man with 7 holes in his head? No artifacts were found beside him. No beads, no blade, no carved figurine. But the way he was laid, arms folded, skull intact, not damaged, not discarded, tells us that he was not thrown away. He was placed, with care. That care matters. It tells us that even if his skull was not used after death, it was respected. Perhaps his community believed the surgeries he endured gave him a different kind of vision. Perhaps they believed his pain had value. Or perhaps they were simply afraid. The truth is, we'll never know for sure, but we can listen to the patterns left behind. The way skulls with trepanation were treated differently, again and again, across space and time. We can see how bone, once opened, carried meaning. Today, these skulls sit in museums and excavation vaults. Not on altars, not around necks, but the sense of all remains. Scientists peer through microscopes. Historians take notes. Visitors stare through glass, wondering what kind of pain would lead a person or a culture to cut through the living skull. But for those who lived it, perhaps it wasn't strange at all. Perhaps the hole in the bone was just another mark, like a scar from fire or a wrinkle of age. A reminder that life is full of suffering and of the quiet, brave attempts to face it. In the end, the legacy of Trepan skulls is not about medicine. It's about memory, about how we carry the stories of pain and what we choose to do with them, whether we bury them, or keep them, or wear them close to our hearts. He may have smiled. That's what you forget, sometimes, when staring at a skull behind museum glass or held gently by gloved hands in an archaeological lab. That it once had a face. That it once carried expression, emotion, memory. That the man beneath those 7 holes once laughed, or sang, or bent down to tie a bundle of reeds, humming a song his mother taught him. He may have danced in a festival under the stars, painted in earth tones, surrounded by others with ash on their foreheads. He may have fallen in love. Once, twice, maybe many times. We do not know who touched his cheek, or kissed his temple just beside the healing edge of a surgical wound. But surely, someone did. No one survives 7 trepanations alone. He may have walked beside rivers, his hand brushing the tops of tall grass, listening for animals in the distance. He may have hunted, or gardened, or carved wood beside a fire while others whispered about him. About the marks on his skull, the strange quietness in his gaze, the things he had endured. He may have been feared. He may have been called sacred. He may have simply been different, caught between the world of the living and something just beyond it. He may have screamed. That part is harder to forget. Because 7 surgeries, 7 stone scrapes into living bone, do not happen without pain. The kind of pain that makes the air collapse in your lungs. That turns time to syrup. That fractures thought. Did he cry out? Did he shake? Did he bite down on wood, on cloth, on his own tongue? Or did he lie still, eyes closed, breathing slow, mind drifting far beyond the hut walls to a place where pain was only a distant drumbeat? You picture the scene. A single fire. Shadows dancing across the curve of his brow. A healer crouched low, lips moving in song or prayer. Others outside, listening but not daring to come in. The sound of the scraping. The sudden silence when it stops. The waiting. And then the breath. In. Out. He lived. Until he didn't. But for a time, he survived what few ever did. And that makes him more than a skeleton. It makes him a question. Not just, why did they cut into his skull? But, why did they keep going? And perhaps deeper still, what did they believe was inside him? Perhaps he was considered gifted. Or burdened. Perhaps the holes were meant to release something dark. Or allow something bright to enter. Perhaps each surgery marked a turning point in his life. A death. A vision. A new role among his people. Perhaps he asked for them. Or begged against them. Or perhaps he just endured. We imagine history as something vast. Empires, kings, monuments. But sometimes it lives in a single person, in 7 holes that should not have healed, but did. In a life lived close to the edge. Not in glory, but in survival. And now, thousands of years later, here we are still talking about him. Still wondering. Still moved by the quiet defiance of his bone. He didn't leave behind a story. No carvings. No spoken name. But he left this. A map of pain, of healing, of mystery. He may have smiled. He may have screamed. But above all, he endured. It is one of the oldest surgical procedures in human history. Long before stitches. Long before antiseptics. Even before writing. Trepanation, cutting or scraping a hole into the human skull, is perhaps the first deliberate act of medicine. Or maybe not medicine at all. That's the mystery. Archaeologists have found trepan skulls dating back over 10,000 years. They appear in nearly every corner of the ancient world. Neolithic Europe, prehistoric Peru, early Africa, tribal Asia. Some show signs of trauma, as if to relieve pressure after an injury. Others appear without any visible damage at all. Just a hole. Clean. Smooth. Deliberate. We know that many of these patients survived. The bone regrew. The edges smoothed out. This wasn't a random or violent act. It was care. Someone took time to open the skull, and someone watched it heal. But what were they trying to do? The first theory is medical. That trepanation was a response to injury, skull fractures from hunting accidents, falls, or fights. In these cases, removing part of the skull might have eased pressure from swelling, or drained fluid, or relieved pain. This theory is supported by skulls with depression fractures near the holes, evidence of trauma and treatment. It paints the ancient healer as practical, observant, a proto-surgeon working with stone. But many trepan skulls show no trauma at all. No crack, no injury, nothing that needed fixing. And so another theory emerges, that the hole was meant not for the body, but for the spirit, to let something out, or to let something in. In ancient cosmologies, the head is often sacred, the seat of the soul, the source of thought, the crown closest to the gods. Illness, especially mental illness, was frequently viewed not as chemical imbalance, but spiritual possession. A person who heard voices or shook uncontrollably might be seen as cursed, haunted, or chosen. And if something dark had entered the skull, opening a door might be the only way to let it leave. Perhaps it was ritual. Perhaps it was symbolic. Perhaps both. There's also the possibility that trepanation was a rite of passage, an initiation into adulthood, healing, or spiritual leadership. A way to mark someone who had undergone transformation. Some skulls bear ornamental holes, carefully placed and artfully shaped, with no medical justification at all. These could be status symbols, a badge of honor in bone. So what was it truly? A surgery? A prayer? A mark of pain? Or an invitation to the divine? We may never fully know. The evidence is silent. The bone does not explain. It only remains. And so trepanation, even now, sits at the crossroads of science and mystery. Too surgical to be dismissed, too spiritual to be explained, too universal to be coincidence. The oldest surgery in history may never have been just a surgery at all. The mystery deepens not just in the skulls, but in the maps. Trepanation was not a local idea. It wasn't confined to one culture, one continent, or one period in time. It happened everywhere, independently, as if scattered across the human timeline like a shared dream. In Neolithic Europe, it emerged with quiet frequency. From France to Ukraine, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of trepanned skulls, some belonging to men, others to women, even children. Often, they appear in farming communities, buried with few possessions. Sometimes, the trepanation is near a visible injury, but just as often, it stands alone. A smooth-edged circle carved into the bone without any sign of trauma. A door without a reason. Thousands of miles away, across oceans and mountains, high in the Andes of Peru, the practice flourished with astonishing complexity. The Inca and their ancestors, including the Paracas and Nazca cultures, turned trepanation into a refined medical art. Their skulls show careful technique, beveled edges, symmetrical openings, multiple surgeries on the same individual. And the survival rate? Remarkably high. In some burial sites, over 60% of trepanned individuals show healing. Why were they doing this? Some Inca skulls show signs of battle trauma, particularly blunt force injuries likely caused by slings and clubs. Trepanation may have been a way to relieve cranial pressure or extract bone fragments. But that's not the whole story. The presence of multiple trepanations, including those without any visible injuries, suggests something deeper, something ritual, or perhaps diagnostic in a way we no longer understand. Healing, yes, but healing of what? Travel east, into the dry sands of ancient Egypt. There, too, trepanation has been found, though rarely. A few skulls from early dynastic graves show surgical openings, some post-mortem, others with partial healing. The Egyptians were among the earliest cultures to document medicine, but trepanation does not appear in their surviving medical texts. This absence is its own question. Was it taboo? Sacred? Reserved only for the priest-healer class? Or simply lost to time? And then, even farther, into the Pacific. Among the peoples of Polynesia and Melanesia, oral traditions speak of skull openings to treat madness, illness, or to release spirits. In Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, skull modification and trepanation may have been practiced not just for healing, but as part of ceremonial initiation. The hole in the head may have been seen as a portal, an exit for what haunted you, or an entrance for what you were meant to become. Even in the highlands of Tibet and remote Siberia, isolated groups developed their own variations of cranial intervention, some as scraping, others as drilling. The tools differed, the motives varied, but the gesture remained the same. What links these cultures? Not language, not trade, not religion, only the human skull, and the belief, widespread, instinctive, unspoken, that something lived inside it, something that could go wrong, and something that, perhaps, could be reached. Trepanation, then, becomes more than a practice. It becomes a shared human intuition. Across time, across geography, people looked at the suffering of the mind, the pain in the head, the silence behind the eyes, and they decided to open the bone. Not because they were primitive, but because they were trying to help. In their own way, in their own time, they reached for healing, or understanding, or contact with something beyond themselves. And that's the real mystery. Not that they did it, but that they all did it. Every hole in a prehistoric skull carries its own quiet theory. Some interpret it as compassion, others as ritual, others still as punishment. And perhaps the truth, like the bone itself, lies layered beneath the surface, complex, not easily scraped away. In many early cultures, illness was not simply physical, it was spiritual. A seizure was not a neurological disorder, it was a sign of possession. A child who shook uncontrollably, a hunter who heard voices, a woman who cried without cause. These were not sick in the modern sense. They were thought to be touched, disturbed, or even chosen. The idea that an invisible force could enter the head and disrupt the mind was common, and if something had entered, then perhaps it could be released. That's the basis of one theory, trepanation as exorcism. A hole, carefully made in the skull, might serve as an exit, a passage through which the spirit could escape. The screams during the procedure? Confirmation. The survival afterward? A miracle. If the suffering ceased, the spirits had been purged. If not, another hole might be needed. Others believe trepanation was a ritual of passage, an act of transformation. Among elite classes or spiritual leaders, the act of having one's skull opened may have symbolized a breaking of the self, a shedding of the mundane. In some societies, only those who had undergone trepanation were allowed to serve as shamans, priests, or healers. The pain, the risk, and the recovery were all part of the journey, an ordeal that made one fit to guide others. But not all interpretations are sacred. In some regions, there's evidence that trepanation may have been a form of punishment, a social corrective. The bone doesn't always show signs of care. Some holes are rough, jagged, shallow, suggesting a rushed, perhaps forced act. Was it a public spectacle? A warning to others? Was it thought that madness could be cut out to restore social order? Or were those deemed dangerous simply experimented on until they succumbed? There's also a more visionary view, trepanation for consciousness expansion. In modern fringe science and in ancient echoes, there's speculation that removing part of the skull could allow the brain to breathe or awaken. This idea, while controversial, has led some to suggest that trepanation may have been used to induce trance, dreams, or even prophetic visions. The notion of the third eye, or sky hole, exists in various cultures, where the head is open not to heal, but to see, to access the divine. Of course, none of these ideas can be proven. The bone tells us that the act happened, but not what was whispered during the procedure, not what was hoped for or feared. Still, the diversity of interpretations tells us something vital. Trepanation was never just physical. It was symbolic. A gesture, a belief made real in bone. A hole that was more than a hole. The stone does not glitter. It does not gleam. It is not shaped like a scalpel or polished like steel. It fits in the palm, rough-edged and worn smooth by use. It is silent, but it has stories to tell, stories of pressure, pain, and a steady hand. The tools of prehistoric trepanation were humble. Flint, obsidian, sandstone, bone. There were no metals, no mirrors, no guides. And yet, these tools opened skulls. With precision, with consistency, and sometimes with success. Scraping is the most commonly observed technique, especially in Neolithic Europe. A stone edge, usually flint or a coarse sandstone disc, was used to slowly grind away at the skull, layer by layer. The healer would scrape in small circles, gradually thinning the outer table of bone. No sudden strikes, no deep cuts, just quiet, patient abrasion. This method was time-consuming. It could take hours, but it allowed for control. A careful healer could stop just before reaching the inner layer of the skull, avoiding fatal puncture. In the best cases, the patient survived and the bone regrew with smooth, rounded edges. Boring, on the other hand, involved puncturing the skull using a sharp, pointed instrument, often a flint awl or sharpened bone, and rotating it back and forth. This method was faster but riskier. It's more commonly found in regions where multiple small holes were made in a circle and then connected, like punching holes in leather to form a larger opening. Some skulls from the Caucasus and North Africa show this pattern. In some cases, the holes were finished with scraping or smoothing. Cutting, the rarest and riskiest of the three, involved slicing directly into the skull with a blade. Obsidian was the favored material here, volcanic glass that can hold an edge sharper than modern surgical steel. But it is also brittle. A mistake could snap the blade or crack the skull. This method appears in some advanced Andean skulls, where trepanations were done with remarkable accuracy. Straight-edged incisions forming rectangles or ovals hint at a level of anatomical knowledge, perhaps learned through generations of trial and error. In all cases, the key wasn't just the tool, it was the touch, the rhythm, the attention. Without anatomy textbooks, without nerve charts, the prehistoric healer relied on intuition, experience, and observation, watching how patients breathed, how they flinched, how they went still, and then stopping at the right moment. Wounds were likely packed with moss, clay, honey, or chewed herbs. The holes were sometimes left open, sometimes covered with bark, hide, or bone plates. No sutures, no antiseptics, just time, and the hope that the spirits or the body would do the rest. The survival of many trepanned individuals tells us that these crude tools, used with care, could work. That healing didn't require metal-only knowledge. Pain, yes, but also wisdom. And perhaps something we've forgotten. The bones don't speak, but they heal. And in their healing, they leave behind quiet proof that someone lived, that someone endured, that someone, thousands of years ago, survived the unimaginable. Trepanation, for all its crude tools and agonizing methods, was not always a death sentence. In fact, in many regions, it had a surprisingly high survival rate. This fact, unsettling to some, astonishing to others, has changed the way we think about prehistoric medicine. Because survival means more than luck. It means skill. It means care. It means they knew what they were doing. So how do we know someone survived a skull surgery? We look at the edges. When a hole is cut into the skull and the person survives for at least a few weeks, the bone begins to react. It responds just as it does to any wound, by repairing itself. New bone begins to form along the rim. It starts out jagged, then smooths into a rounded edge. Sometimes, in skulls where the person lived months or years afterward, the healing is so complete the hole looks like it was always meant to be there. In Peru, where hundreds of trypan skulls have been found, studies show survival rates as high as 80 to 90% in some communities, especially in the late Inca period. These weren't accidental successes. They were repeated, consistent, and often beautifully executed. The edges are smooth. The wounds show no infection. The placement is precise. This suggests not only surgical expertise, but also post-operative care. Something we rarely associate with pre-modern medicine. In Neolithic Europe, the survival rates are more modest, but still impressive. Among skulls found in France, Germany, and the Balkans, 40 to 60% show signs of healing. Even among individuals with multiple trepanations, like the man with 7 holes in his head, healing occurred more than once, meaning not only was he treated repeatedly, but his body recovered again and again. And it wasn't just the strong who survived. Some trypan skulls belonged to children, others to elders, people who would have been vulnerable, frail, or already sick. Yet they lived long enough for the bone to knit itself together. What does this tell us? It tells us that prehistoric communities didn't simply cut open skulls out of desperation or fear. They did it with hope, with confidence, with a working knowledge of what might help. It also tells us they cared. These weren't throwaway people. They weren't left to die. Someone stayed with them, fed them, cleaned their wounds, waded through fever, sang through the night, carried them back from the edge. Even more astonishing is what we don't see. Very few trypan skulls show signs of infection. No bone rot, no pus pockets, no evidence of sepsis. In a world without antiseptics, that is remarkable. It suggests they used natural antibiotics, honey, ash, herbs, or that they instinctively understood how to keep a wound clean. It also tells us something deeply human. That pain was not the end of the story. That those who screamed during the scraping might have later walked again. That those who fell unconscious beneath stone tools might have woken to another morning, another season, another life. The healing speaks softly, but clearly. They survived. And that changes everything. To the modern eye, the skull is a symbol of death, somber, still, final. But in many ancient cultures, it meant something entirely different. It was not just the end of a life. It was a vessel of memory, identity, and sacred power. And when that skull bore a hole, a trepanation, it became something more. A relic, a portal, a mark of transformation. In parts of Neolithic Europe, trypan skulls were treated with special care. Some were found not in burial grounds, but in homes placed under floors, beside hearths, or tucked into niches. These were not discarded remains. They were objects of meaning. Perhaps they were ancestors, kept close to protect the living. Or perhaps the skull, once opened, was thought to contain a fragment of sacred energy, something that lingered even after death. There is evidence, too, that some trypan skulls were repurposed after death, not in cruelty, but in reverence. In several archaeological sites across Europe and Central Asia, fragments of skulls have been discovered shaped into discs or pendants, worn like amulets. The presence of a healed trepanation in these fragments raises the possibility that survivors of the procedure were seen as special, touched, or protected by spirits. Carrying a piece of their bone may have been a way to share in that protection or keep their power close. In other places, trypan skulls were turned into vessels. In some Indian and Himalayan cultures, the top portion of a skull, once healed and then later cut again after death, was polished and used as a cup or bowl. These skull cups were often part of rituals, possibly involving communication with ancestors or the consumption of sacred substances. The hole, once a path for pain or healing, now became a rim to sip from. A strange, solemn full circle. And in yet other cultures, the entire skull was preserved, painted, or even worn. In parts of Papua New Guinea and Borneo, human skulls, particularly those of warriors or respected elders, were adorned with feathers, ochre, beads, or even gold. These were not grisly trophies. They were seen as living presences, as containers of wisdom or spiritual guardianship. A trypan skull, marked by a lifetime of endurance, might have held even more significance. All of these practices point to a common belief that the skull, especially one that had been opened, was not just bone. It was a boundary, between life and death, between the physical and the spiritual, between the known and the unknowable. Perhaps the act of trepanation was never meant to heal in the way we think of healing. Perhaps it was meant to transform, to shift the person from one state to another, to make them a bridge between worlds. And when they died, that transformation didn't fade. It remained in the bone. It is easy to see the hole in the skull as a wound, but to ancient eyes, it may have been something else. A symbol, a message, a key. Trepanation feels ancient, like something that should have stayed buried in the bones of the past. And yet, it never quite disappeared. Even in modern times, in a world of surgical theaters and digital brain scans, there are those who believe that drilling a hole in the skull can unlock something profound. Not pain relief, not emergency surgery, but something else, something spiritual. The most well-known example comes from the 1960s, a time of exploration, rebellion, and the breaking of boundaries. In Amsterdam, a Dutch medical student named Bart Hughes made headlines not for his studies, but for his self-trepanation. Convinced that modern humans suffer from chronic brain compression due to the closed nature of the adult skull, he proposed that drilling a hole would restore what he called brain blood volume and enhance consciousness. In 1965, using a foot-pedal dentist drill, Hughes opened his own skull. He survived and spent the rest of his life advocating for trepanation as a path to higher awareness. Others followed. Amanda Fielding, a British artist and countess, performed trepanation on herself in 1970, filming the entire process for a short film titled Heartbeat in the Brain. She later founded the Beckley Foundation, which researches altered states of consciousness, though she no longer promotes trepanation. Still, the story left its mark. These modern seekers weren't trying to treat head trauma. They were reaching for something immaterial, expanded consciousness, clarity, enlightenment. They believed, as some ancient cultures may have believed, that the skull was not meant to be sealed forever. That the pressure of modern life, or the constraints of biology, had disconnected the mind from its natural flow. Today, the practice is rare, controversial, and widely condemned by medical professionals. DIY trepanation is dangerous. Infections, brain damage, and death are real risks. No peer-reviewed study has confirmed any of the consciousness-enhancing claims. The mainstream medical world places trepanation firmly in the past or in operating rooms, where it still exists as a last resort to relieve pressure after trauma or stroke. But even so, the belief hasn't entirely vanished. In fringe spiritual circles, the skull retains its symbolic power. Some holistic groups speak of cranial release in metaphoric terms. Others meditate on the idea of opening the mind through sound, vibration, or light, non-invasive echoes of a much older practice. Some cultures still preserve ancestral skulls as sacred objects. Some artists, philosophers, and mystics continue to reference the third eye, the crown chakra, the soft spot we all had as infants before the skull closed. Trepanation lingers not as a mainstream movement, but as a curious remnant, a ghost of a belief. Perhaps it speaks to a deeper human urge not to harm, but to reach beyond, to touch something larger than the self, to open a door, even if we no longer know what's behind it. The ancient trepan skulls tell us we once reached for the unknown with stone tools and trembling hands. The modern ones remind us, some still do. We have the holes. We have the bones. We even have the tools, still sharp after thousands of years. But what we don't have, what we may never have, is certainty. That's the haunting beauty of trepanation. For all our science, for all our scans and reconstructions and carbon dates, we still don't know exactly why they did it. We can measure the cut, estimate the healing, even trace the mineral content of the skull. But we cannot see what they saw. We cannot feel what they felt. We cannot reach back into the moment a trembling hand pressed stone to living bone and began to carve. Were they trying to heal? Yes, almost certainly. But heal what, exactly? A cracked skull? A tormented mind? A cursed soul? Or maybe it wasn't about healing at all. Maybe the hole was not the cure, but the message. A sign of who someone had become. Or what they had survived. A statement written in the most permanent medium they had, bone. And even if they were trying to heal, we can't know what success looked like to them. Was survival enough? Was a brief relief from pain a victory? Or was the hole itself, the act of opening, the goal? A ritual that had to be performed, whether or not the body lived. We try to answer with comparisons, with probabilities, with statistics. But the data does not whisper what the healer whispered. The bone does not retell the song that was sung during the procedure. or the fear in the patient's eyes, or the hope that filled the hut like smoke? And what of the people themselves? The communities that allowed this to happen, not once, but thousands of times across the world. What did it mean to them? Were the trepanned honored? Pitied? Feared? Were they set apart? Or were they simply part of the everyday struggle to push back against the unknown, one scrape at a time? Even now, with every new trepanned skull unearthed, we must sit with more questions than answers. We marvel at the survival rates, we compare techniques, we map out timelines. But still the mystery remains. Perhaps that is what draws us back. Because in those empty circles of bone, there is a kind of mirror. They reflect not just what we used to be, but who we still are, creatures trying to understand pain, trying to reach beyond suffering, trying to find meaning in what the body cannot explain. We don't know what the trepanation holes meant to those who made them, but we know what they mean to us. They mean we were not passive. They mean we tried. They mean we were curious, even in fear. They mean that long before we had science, we had courage. And maybe, just maybe, that's the answer the bones are still trying to give us. While one man lay groaning in a smoky hut, his skull exposed to the edge of a stone, another stood at the top of a hill, watching hundreds of laborers raise stones that would outlast his name. 2 lives. Same era, but worlds apart. It's easy to think of prehistory as a single condition, hard, short, and simple. But even in the Neolithic and early Bronze Age, the world was layered. Class existed. Wealth, though measured differently, was very real. Power had already begun to collect in certain hands. And while common people bled, built, and buried their sick with whatever knowledge they had, others were planning legacies in stone. The man with the trepanned skull lived in a village. He slept on straw. He may have worn a tunic of woven grass or stitched hides. His days were filled with work, grinding grain, tending animals, foraging herbs. When illness came, it came without warning and with no promise of care. His healers worked with chipped flint, chance, and fire smoke. The tools were humble, the risks enormous, and the suffering intimate. Every cry could be heard through thin walls. But just over the hill, perhaps only a few days' walk away, another class lived entirely differently. At sites like Newgrange in Ireland, Stonehenge in England, or the Gantija temples in Malta, megalithic structures were being raised by societies that had organized labor, spiritual hierarchies, and elites who likely never knew the taste of desperation. These places weren't just ceremonial, they were statements. Monuments to control, to permanence, to a belief that the chosen few could shape the world around them not with pain, but with vision. These elites didn't live in mud huts. They lived in the center of things. They were fed first. They were buried last and best. Tombs filled with beads, axes, carved figurines, and, sometimes, entire buildings were built just to contain their remains. Their skulls were not cut open with stone tools in dark corners. They were gilded, perhaps painted, perhaps placed atop altars to remind others of their power. The contrast is startling. One person's skull was opened to ease a spirit. Another's was placed in a tomb so it could become one. Yet both lived in the same time frame, roughly 3000 to 4000 BCE. Both breathed the same air. Both watched the stars in the same sky. This disparity, this tension between pain and privilege, was already embedded in the earliest human settlements. Even then, the suffering of the body and the ambition of power walked side by side. And so, while villagers risked death in the hope of healing, others, draped in woven finery, surrounded by servants and ceremonies, prepared their names to be remembered in stone. No scraping, no screams, only legacy. 2 worlds, one past, and a story we still live, in one way or another, even now. In a world without thrones, without gold coins or written laws, power still found a way to rise and settle itself above the rest. The Neolithic elite did not wear crowns, but you knew who they were. They ate the choicest meat, their bones showed less wear, and their graves were deeper, richer, and more carefully sealed. They were the chiefs, the priest leaders, the keepers of ritual and land. In their hands was not just authority, but belief. A belief that they were closer to the gods, to the ancestors, to the forces that kept the sun moving and the crops alive. And beside them, often intertwined with their role, stood the shamans. These were not the village healers scraping skulls in huts. These were spiritual figures of prestige. Their role was not to ease pain, but to interpret it, to explain why it happened, what spirit had caused it, what offering might be needed to make it stop. They didn't sweat over wounds. They spoke over them. They didn't touch the sick. They defined them. And in doing so, they kept their distance, wrapped in ritual, protected by mystery. Together, the chief and the shaman created a system. One ruled the body, the other ruled the unseen. And together, they kept order, through ceremony, through control, and through selective elevation of those they deemed worthy. Unlike the humble healer whose hands were stained with blood and ash, these figures stood apart. If their skulls were ever trepanned, it was not out of desperation, it was out of symbolism. A ritual act to open the mind. A public gesture of divine connection. But more often, they did not undergo the procedure at all. They had others for that. They may have directed the burial of trepanned individuals. They may have given the word that marked someone possessed or chosen. Their role was not to suffer, but to name the suffering of others. And by naming it, they shaped the way the entire community reacted. In tombs from this era, some skeletons show signs of respect long after death, skulls painted with ochre, surrounded by amulets, placed in positions of honor. These were likely people of status, leaders, spiritual intermediaries, those believed to carry the power of ancestors in their blood. Their bones were clean, their heads unbroken. They didn't need holes in their skulls. They had protection. In this way, power in the Neolithic world was more than strength. It was distance from pain. While common people risked death to find relief, the elite performed rituals from a safe remove. They offered explanations, not remedies. They promised meaning, not medicine. And when their time came, they were laid to rest beneath mounds or stone chambers, untouched, undrilled, but still speaking, not with wounds, but with symbols. For the powerful, the skull was never just a bone. It was a message. It was the seed of memory, the container of spirit, and perhaps most importantly, the proof of bloodline. In the hands of Neolithic elites, the skull became not a site of healing, but a symbol of who you were, or who you had conquered. In several megalithic tombs across Europe and the Near East, archaeologists have found skulls arranged deliberately, sometimes grouped in circles, sometimes stacked, sometimes placed facing east or toward the rising sun. These were not random burials. These were ritual displays, choreographed in stone. The skulls were often older than the bones buried nearby, as if brought from earlier generations. Ancestors, perhaps, were tokens of legitimacy. To rule was not just to live, it was to link yourself to those who came before, and to prove that you belonged among them. In this way, lineage was literal. It was visible. It was kept. Some elite families may have curated skulls the way others curated titles, displayed them, prayed to them, even passed them on. The belief was that the spirit of the dead could guide the living, and the closer you kept that skull, the more protection or wisdom you could draw from it. These were not symbols of death. They were totems of continuity. But the skull could also mean conquest. In tribal and warrior-based societies, the heads of enemies were not always buried. They were kept, hung from poles, displayed at village entrances, turned into drinking vessels, or carved into art. This wasn't just intimidation. It was a kind of absorption. By possessing the head, you claimed victory over the whole person. Their strength became yours. Their defeat became your reminder. Elite warriors, especially in Bronze Age Europe and parts of Central Asia, may have decorated their homes with the skulls of rivals. These displays were both political and personal, a declaration of dominance and a reminder of loyalty to one's own clan. In some rare cases, trepanned skulls themselves may have become symbolic trophies, not because of who they belonged to, but because of what they represented. A skull that had survived a surgery could be seen as sacred, marked by spirits, or possessing a kind of inner sight. To keep such a skull might be to guard its mystery or control it, but whether kept as a family relic, a spiritual vessel, or a trophy of war, the skull meant power. It was not opened. It was displayed. It was not healed. It was inherited. And that, too, marks the difference between the healer and the ruler. The healer worked on skulls that had cracked from suffering. The ruler curated skulls that had never been touched by pain, only by reverence or violence, but never by desperation. In the world of the elite, bone was not something to fix. It was something to use, something to show, something to pass on. While common villagers scraped away at skulls in low huts lit by flickering firelight, far grander projects were rising from the earth stone by stone, under open sky, orchestrated by the powerful. These were not places of suffering, but of symbolism. Tombs, ceremonial avenues, temples aligned to the stars. Structures so massive, so precise, that they still stand today. Their purpose was not to save a life, but to honor death, to shape belief, and to immortalize authority. At Newgrange in Ireland, around 3200 BCE, a monument was built that predates both the pyramids of Egypt and the stones of Stonehenge. It is a passage tomb, a vast, circular mound of earth and stone, fronted by a white quartz facade, with an entrance aligned so precisely that on the morning of the winter solstice, the sun pierces its long stone corridor and lights the innermost chamber. This was not for everyone. This was for the few, the chosen, the elite. The burial chamber contained only a small number of remains, cremated bones carefully arranged in stone basins. These were not victims of fever or trepanation. These were individuals of high status, selected to rest beneath a celestial calendar carved in stone. Stonehenge, too, built in phases between 300 and 2000 BCE, speaks to the power of ceremony. Though its full purpose remains uncertain, its alignment to solstices, its connection to nearby burial mounds, and its scale suggest an elite-driven project, one that gathered labor from surrounding communities to serve a purpose beyond survival. This wasn't a healing site. It was a statement, an assertion that the people who commanded it had both the vision and the authority to summon generations of labor for a monument that touched the sky. In Malta, the Gantija Temple's massive limestone complexes were constructed with stones weighing up to 50 tons. These megaliths were not shelters. They were sacred spaces, possibly dedicated to a goddess of fertility or earth. Within their chambers, ceremonial objects have been found, offering bowls, carved figurines, and altars. The temples were not built by common hands for common use. They were designed by the few, maintained by the few, and likely restricted in access to those deemed worthy. What all of these sites share is labor. Labor that would have required coordination, planning, and leadership. Labor that was likely compelled, if not by force, then by belief. To build a tomb was to participate in eternity. But not everyone was invited. The elite designed these projects not just to commemorate, but to elevate themselves, to ensure their memory was housed in stone while others faded into the soil. And while the sick lay moaning behind woven mats, their skulls exposed to scraping stones, the chiefs and shamans stood before firelit stones, reciting chants to the heavens. They were not seeking to fix what was broken. They were celebrating what they believed could not break: their power, their lineage, their place in the order of the world. The stones remain. The skulls remain. But the stories they tell could not be more different. In the world of early human civilization, labor was not shared equally. It was divided, cleanly, deliberately, and often invisibly. While some bodies toiled under the weight of stone and soil, others remained upright, holding the plans, offering commands, and marking time not by hours of toil, but by the movement of the stars. This was the quiet foundation of inequality, that some lives were spent surviving, while others were spent envisioning. One group labored in fields and huts. The other stood at the center of circles made of stone, their heads lifted toward the sky. If you were born without status, your life was shaped by physical effort. You harvested crops under the sun, carried water from streams, chopped firewood until your palms blistered. You bent over the same soil that buried your ancestors and would one day bury you. You were expected to work when the light came and rest when it left. You learned to read the weather, not for ceremony, but for survival. A good harvest meant food through the winter. A failed one meant hunger. There was no luxury of abstraction. The land was not symbolic. It was essential. But the elite lived differently. They watched the seasons not to till the earth, but to mark festivals. They observed the sky not to predict rain, but to align tombs and temples with celestial events. Solstice, equinox, the return of certain stars. Their calendars were spiritual, mathematical, ceremonial. They had time to think, to plan, to study, because others were doing the sweating. At places like Nabta Playa in Egypt and Arkham in Russia, circular arrangements of stone suggest early astronomical observation, structures aligned with precision to track solar and lunar cycles. But these weren't communal projects of curiosity. They were guided by the elite, who used the stars to assert control. If they could predict the sun's return, they could claim to command it. If they could measure the moon, they could claim to understand time better than the rest. And if you held time, you held power. Laborers didn't question why stones were being hauled for weeks to build a mound they'd never enter. The rituals weren't meant for them. The stories, the myths, the logic behind it all, it belonged to a different tier of society. One that didn't blister. One that didn't scream during trepanation. One that had the luxury of assigning meaning to the very world you just survived in. It is likely that those scraping holes into skulls under firelight never saw the final alignment of stones at places like Stonehenge or Newgrange. They didn't chant in the chambers, they buried their sick at the edge of the woods. They didn't carve spirals into quartz to honor the sun, they cut into bone to silence pain. Their monuments were not eternal, they were temporary, fragile, and buried in dirt. But still, they endured. Still, they tried. Still, they healed, or hoped to. The elites built monuments to outlive time. The common people built lives that could survive it. Two kinds of labor. Two kinds of legacy. Both written into the earth. One with stone, the other with scars. Luxury didn't begin with gold thrones or silk robes. It began with choice. The choice not to labor every hour for survival. The choice to possess something that was not necessary, but beautiful. Even in prehistory, when life was short and the margin for survival was thin, there were those who had more than enough. And when the body was not burdened with hunger or pain, the mind turned to decoration, to beads, pigments, carvings, and precious stones carried from far beyond the village borders. The graves of prehistoric elites tell a story of surplus. A story not written in language, but in objects. In the Alpine Iceman, buried around 3300 BCE, archaeologists found a copper axe, evidence of not just metallurgy, but value. Nearby were tools shaped for function, yes, but also form. A finely stitched cloak, patterned leggings, beads. These weren't the belongings of someone scraping by. They were curated, selected, worn with intention. At Catalhoyuk in ancient Anatolia, female skeletons were found with caches of obsidian mirrors, baskets of shell beads, and elaborately painted walls in their homes. These were not symbols of wealth as we understand them, but they were status. The shells came from the distant Mediterranean, the obsidian from volcanoes miles away. These materials were carried, traded, gifted, and they gathered at the feet of those with power. Luxury meant distance from need. If you didn't have to gather food every day, you had time to carve, to shape stones, to grind pigment and paint the walls of your home not with warnings, but with beauty. In tombs across Neolithic Europe, ochre was scattered around bodies like dust from another world, red like blood, sacred as sunrise. Jewelry, too, was common. Boar's tusks polished to a sheen, amber beads strung on plant fibers, and bone combs carved with spirals that mirrored the cosmos. These adornments weren't merely for fashion. They were declarations. They said, I have more than I need. And that message, subtle, silent, resonated. And then there was trade. Even in 3000 BCE, networks stretched far. Jade from the Alps reached Brittany. Baltic amber found its way to Mycenae. Seashells crossed hundreds of miles inland. The elite were not confined by geography. They were linked by exchange. Not everyone could trade. Not everyone had anything worth giving. But those who could, those who controlled resources or people, acquired more than goods. They acquired reach. While one person begged for pain to stop, another one received a seashell necklace from a far-off coast. While a healer bent over a sick child's skull with a flint tool, somewhere nearby, a chief lifted a cup carved from bone, trimmed in gold leaf, and filled with fermented honey. Luxury, in its oldest form, was the power to accumulate, to collect meaning, material, and memory. It meant you didn't have to explain your value. You wore it. It's easy to see prehistoric life as universally harsh. But for the few, it was not just survivable, it was beautiful, curated, controlled, quietly abundant. And that difference, between healing with stone and adorning with it, still echoes. One carved bone to ease pain, the other to display prestige, both left behind. But only one was ever meant to be buried in a tomb. Not all healing was equal. Even in prehistory, when the world lacked hospitals, doctors, and formal treatments, the difference between who received care and how they received it was already being shaped by status. The village healer, hunched beside a straw mat, may have had only basic tools, sharpened flint, a bowl of water, moss, and a few dried herbs. But even in that small space, choices were made. Some patients were treated with urgency, with extra hands, with care that stretched into days. Others were left to the rhythms of chance. And often, those choices were made not by diagnosis, but by who the person was. Was it a respected elder? A young child from a prominent family? A shaman's apprentice? If so, the fire was kept burning all night. The poultices were fresh. The chants were long. But if the patient was a laborer, a widow, a stranger, the tools might be used with less ceremony, with less hope. The elite may have had fewer reasons to seek desperate treatment, but when they did, the care they received likely reflected their place in the world. Their wounds were tended by the most skilled hands available. Their sickness brought offerings and rituals. If trepanation was needed, perhaps it happened in the cleaner part of the dwelling, with warmer water, with extra assistance, with a deeper belief that this person must survive. Even among early burial sites, differences in healing outcomes hint at medical inequality. Trepanned skulls from high-status graves often show signs of cleaner incisions and greater healing, as though the procedures were more carefully planned, more patiently executed. In contrast, common graves reveal trepanations that are crude, rushed, or incomplete. Survival was possible in both groups, but the conditions were not the same. And then there is the unspoken medicine, time. To heal from trepanation or any serious wound, a person needed rest, food, protection, someone to watch over them. The elite had all of these. Their injuries were not just treated, they were allowed to mend. The poor, by contrast, may have returned to labor too soon. Infections set in. The wound reopened. The healing failed. There were also social healings, the rituals that surrounded illness. The songs sung over a chief's bed were not the same as those whispered over a farmer's child. The community's grief was deeper for those with lineage. Their recovery became a collective goal. And yet, perhaps the most powerful contrast of all was this. The elite could afford to let others suffer on their behalf. The healer bled from the effort. The assistant stayed up all night. The family offered livestock. The burden of one person's sickness became the work of many, because that one person mattered more. The contrast in medicine wasn't always visible. It was felt, in who lived, who lingered, and who was left behind. In the end, prehistoric healing was not just about tools or knowledge. It was about who you were, and how much pain the world thought you were worth relieving. History has a strange way of dividing itself. We remember the monuments, the rulers, the tombs aligned with the stars. We walk through ancient ruins and imagine kings with staffs, queens with veils, rituals carried out in stone chambers. But rarely do we picture the healer in the mud hut, grinding bone with stone, whispering comfort through the smoke. The monuments remain. The pain does not. And yet, both stories are true. One is etched in stone, the other in silence. The elite raised temples, commanded labor, passed their names down through generations. They watched the skies and measured time with shadow and light. Their lives were insulated by position, their deaths honored with pigments and polished goods. They were remembered not just because of who they were, but because they had the means to leave behind structures. But the others, those who crouched beside the sick, who stitched with bone needles, who scraped open skulls hoping the spirits would listen, they left behind something else. Proof of effort, of courage, of care. Their legacy isn't a monument. It's a wound that healed. They are two histories, running in parallel, one of power, the other of persistence. One built to last, the other built to serve. One survives in carved lintels and burial mounds. The other, in the smooth edge of bone once opened in agony, now sealed by time. It's tempting to call one more important, but they belong to the same story. The story of humans reaching, suffering, believing, surviving. And when we hold the skull of a man with 7 holes in his head, or stand in the shadow of a stone that has not fallen in 5,000 years, we are not just looking back. We are listening to both voices, to the scream, and to the silence that followed.